the subject for tonight is what is likely the most important organization created in healthcare the last 100 years. It was really a tremendous breakthrough when the Cochrane Collaboration was established in 1993. And then recently, it has gone downhill. So we are going to discuss what was so fantastic about Cochrane when it appeared 30 years ago, how you saw it, when you first learned about Cochrane and what your perception of it was, and why you think it was so helpful for patients and doctors and everybody else in healthcare. So let's start with, when did you first hear about Cochrane and what was it? What is it?
So I was working alongside scientists at the University of British Columbia with a group called the Therapeutics Initiative. And those folks do very critical analyses of clinical trials, and they really do the deep dive and try to educate physicians and pharmacists on the best evidence to use when prescribing. And the people involved in the Therapeutics Initiative at UBC were also members of Cochrane. They were members of the Cochrane Hypertension Group. And I was invited to my first colloquium. So the Cochrane Collaboration holds an annual meeting in a different location in the world. And that year it was in Ottawa, 2004, I believe. That was the year when I was in the process of writing my book, Selling Sickness, and I went to Ottawa. So Cochrane had already existed for more than 10 years before I went to my first colloquium, though I had known it for those 10 years, partly because when you look around the world about who does independent reporting of analysis and reporting of clinical trials, the group that comes up most often is Cochrane, known for its independence, did not have industry sponsorship, which I think is in the process of corrupting medicine in many ways, when you have pharmaceutical manufacturers paying for the creation of reviews and trials. And so you need an independent group, a group that can be self-funded. And Cochrane had a pretty successful model. It was able to largely use volunteers. They're talking maybe at its height, 30,000 volunteers from around the world. And these volunteers would assess a particular problem using whatever evidence they could find. They judged the quality of the evidence, and then they did meta-analyses and really tried to break down, was a drug or a health intervention beneficial? To what degree was it beneficial, and what kind of harm did it produce? Very reliable stuff. My closest, though, so I went to many colloquiums since 2004, and it wasn't until I think it was 2012 that I went to the colloquium in Keystone, Colorado. And there my name was kind of known as writing books about healthcare, and I was asked if I would be interested in doing a sort of social history of the Cochrane Collaboration. And I immediately said yes. It sounded very exciting. I made some stipulations. I said, if you're going to do this project, you're going to have to put some funding in it. You have to hire a videographer, someone who can actually record and really collect the stories of, the key people in the Cochrane Collaboration. And so I directed a videographer to do. We did more than 100 interviews, and I was able to travel to places like Oxford and meet and interview in great depth the founder. One of the main founders is Dr. Ian Chalmers, and really get a sense of how this organization, how it started, and sort of what it's become. And it was very exciting to work on this book, to interview all these fabulous people who are in very, very much selfless, public-spirited, very interested in finding the truth and using that truth to try to improve healthcare.
Yeah.
So a fabulous organization with very highly motivated volunteers, including yourself, were one of the founders. So you know as much as I do about the history of the collaboration. You were there at the beginning, and
but,
so yes.
But let's go back to the beginning.
Mm.
There were only about 80 people who gathered in Oxford and decided to create the Cochrane Collaboration. And as you say, I was one of them. And it was really fantastic because this was an idealistic thing, a grassroots organization. We didn't have any funding. So we struggled to get funding. But what united us was that the medical literature is so unreliable and often manipulated by monetary interest, by the drug industry, and by academic aspirations and so on. So guilt interest and whatever. So we wanted to do better and find out, especially through the randomized trials, what worked and what didn't, and what the harms were. And as you said, we were very generous to each other. We did not compete. We actually tried to help each other. So the beginning of Cochrane was totally different from any other organization ever created by doctors. And people just loved it. And then you came into the picture some years later, as you said, and you were asked by the leadership of Cochrane to write a book because Cochrane's 20th anniversary,
that's right,
was about to happen 2 years after you were asked to write a book about Cochrane. And that was in 2011. I remember you went around at a Cochrane colloquium in Madrid and interviewed us with a filmmaker. And you were also writing on your book. But then something happened because you better explain yourself what happened with that book that you were hired to write.
So there's the book that resulted, though it wasn't published by Cochrane or Wiley or any big publisher. It was published by myself. I used a local publisher. This book had more than 20 chapters, again, based on hundreds of interviews of people within the Cochrane Collaboration and outside. So I wanted to talk to people, not only people who were supporters of Cochrane, but people who were critics and people who would who were in some ways considered to be troublemakers. And some of those troublemakers made it into my book. When I say troublemakers, like people that did reviews that some in the establishment didn't like. For example, I could point to some of the mammography work that you did, Peter, and later some of the critical reviews that you did on psychiatry. You were featured in my book, as was somebody like Tom Jefferson, again, very strong scientist, doing probably some of the heaviest bench lifting in terms of analyzing influenza and the value of influenza vaccines and drugs such as oseltamivir. And so my book did focus on, I think, the people that were really trying to move the bar. We're really trying to establish, scientific norms, defending Cochrane's name against commercial interests, which was a long fought battle for many years. People arguing, if we don't take money from the drug industry, we won't survive. And the other argument was, if you do take money from the drug industry, you shouldn't survive.
Yes, exactly.
and I don't have to tell your audience which side you were on, but you were a part of that fight, and it was very fascinating to see the arguments that were used within Cochrane back and forth about, say, commercial sponsorship. But we had it wasn't big pharma that was funding Cochrane, it was big publishing. In this case, it was Wiley. Cochrane got along very well, and the Cochrane Library was published by a very small group initially. Again, people publicly motivated, very interested in keeping the good online records of Cochrane's work, until Cochrane signed an agreement with Wiley, a big major scientific publisher, and was able to use Wiley to manage the Cochrane Library and charge fees, and those fees helped pay for reviews. you might say, well, that's a great model. The problem, of course, is that when you've got big publishing involved, it's like big anything. It's very corporate. It establishes, it tends to diminish the volunteer spirit that people have. People feel like they're working for a big corporation instead of just a group of friends that want to get at the truth. And so I would say the beginning of the, if you want to call it the demise of Cochrane, happened when Cochrane signed this deal with Wiley, which was very controversial at the time. But and some said it gave it worldwide notice. Wiley had lots of money; they could advertise, they could promote, and so on. Though Cochrane, if you have good truth, you don't need to spend a lot of money promoting it. People will find it, and if you do good quality work, you don't need a big communications arm. You just need high quality, and so
that's true. But we did need a good deal of money in order to run the Cochrane Collaboration, because even though there were all these volunteers, some infrastructure was also necessary.
Absolutely.
In order
and governments were quite good. The UK government, and I know the Danish government, the Canadian government, over the years funded Cochrane more or less. And so having government money plus subscription money, that's what kind of carried the group. As time went on, though, as you've noted both in your book and elsewhere, the corporatization of Cochrane really came to a head when they hired a kind of hotshot CEO who wanted to bring in corporate principles of how to run organizations. And you might say good public administration is a good thing to have. However, I think that was the beginning of people becoming disillusioned with Cochrane, because decisions that were made were sometimes against the ethos.
Now, Alan, you're from Canada.
Yes.
And I cannot resist the temptation to mention that when Cochrane in 2012 hired a new CEO, Mark Wilson, who is a journalist by education, there was a criticism in the Canadian Medical Journal, something about people raising eyebrows. Why did Cochrane hire a CEO? It is an intensely scientific organization. A CEO who doesn't know what science is about, a journalist. How could that happen? That was actually commented on in the Canadian Medical Association's journal.
Yes. Part of it, I think, is that some people felt that the Cochrane needed to kind of grow up. It needed to be more professional. It needed to be better managed. It needed to, it had to use the tools of kind of high-level public administration, and that's what they do. They hire corporate leaders, and they endow them with a certain amount of power. Though we know that the organization had a democratic board, a democratically elected board, and the CEO was to report to the board. The problem is that in board politics, oftentimes the CEO tells the board what to do as opposed to the board telling the CEO what to do. And I think that that happened. So
this was exactly what happened in Cochrane, because I ran for the governing board and was elected for the governing board with the most votes, even though I was the only candidate of 11 that had criticized the CEO and the leadership. Normally, when you do that, you don't get many votes, but I got the most votes. And when I had become elected to the governing board not so many years ago, I quickly realized that although it was the task of the governing board to control the CEO, the situation was completely opposite. The governing board behaved like lapdogs to the CEO. He had total power in Cochrane. And that's one of the reasons Cochrane went downhill. But let's first also come back to your book, because you told me when we met in New Hampshire at a meeting that you were very disappointed because Cochrane had just killed your book, you said. How did that happen?
Well, I worked back and forth with a number of editors, a number of people who could read my manuscript, give good positive feedback. And the feedback was very good. And I included had David Tovey, who was the what was his position?
Editor-in-chief of Cochrane.
He was the editor-in-chief of the library, Cochrane Library, and great guy. And he did some suggested, he wanted to save the book. He thought the book needed some improvement, though at some level, and I was never really told, he is the one that delivered the bad news and said, we're not going to publish your book. We're not going to get ahead with the project. And they actually refused to pay my last contract as well. So I was out a little bit of money. But as you know, sometimes it feels good.
Wait a minute. If you have a contract with them and you have written a book, how can they refuse to pay you?
I guess they can do whatever they want. I mean, what am I going to do?
Oh, if you have a contract.
Yeah. So they didn't. They would say that I didn't complete my terms of the contract in terms of giving them a publishable manuscript.
Oh, but wait a minute. Wait a minute. When I asked you back then why Mark Wilson killed your book, as you told me he did, the CEO, it wasn't David Tovey, the editor-in-chief, it was Mark Wilson. Then I asked you.
I don't know for sure. I think so, but I don't know for sure.
No, but he controlled everything. You know that as well as I do. And then I asked you, what was wrong with your book? And I shall never remember your remark. There was too much Peter Gøtzsche in it.
So yes, there is Peter Gøtzsche in this book, but there are also other renegades in this book. People like Hilda Bastian and Ian Chalmers, other people that were in a sense renegades. Tom Jefferson. The term hagiography? Hagiography means making a saint out of someone. I wasn't going to make saints out of people. I wanted to show the good and the bad, right? I wanted to tell a realistic narrative that points out that this is not just an uncontroversial and simple organization. It's a complex organization, and there's many viewpoints. And there are people that are challenging the status quo. And I think that you were probably in the top of their hit list, but you weren't the only one that was fired from Cochrane, Peter. I was as well.
Yes, but when I read your manuscript, I really liked it because what you had done was to tell the world who made Cochrane. And this is not a politically correct book. I mean, Mark Wilson was pretty new in Cochrane, and as I remember, you didn't mention him at all in the book because he had not contributed anything, and there were
his contribution just wasn't that interesting. I mean,
exactly, and there were other people who saw themselves as some great guys. Whom you hardly did not discuss in the book because your view was that they didn't really contribute to making Cochrane what it was. So
plus I wasn't writing hagiography. I wasn't creating saints out of ordinary people. And and if that's what they wanted me to do, they should have hired somebody else.
but it was so bad, and you were so sad back then. And I then offered you that when Cochrane wouldn't pay you, I was prepared to donate some money from my grants to make sure that the book got published, because I was outraged by the treatment you received from the Cochrane leadership. But then you managed to get the book published anyhow without the money I could offer you. But then later, Cochrane went downhill. Cochrane was widely regarded as something you could trust. We did what we could to get rid of bias in medical research and present the truth as closely as possible we could get to it, and make people think for themselves. And if they were unhappy, they could send comments to a Cochrane review, and that could be published with the review, and the review could be improved.
Right.
So we were very idealistic, but then it went downhill. And I also want you, from your perspective, to say, what happened? Why did it go downhill?
Yeah, many factors. I think the controversy over you really created a schism, I think, within the organization. There were those who were saying, and you probably know this, but there are those who are saying Peter Gøtzsche is an outlier. He's he can't obey authority. He has to be pushed aside. There was other in the group, as you know, you had many defenders and many supporters who said, no, what are you talking about? Peter's the kind of guy we want in the Cochrane Collaboration. People who are courageous and can stand up and speak truth to power, even when the reviews don't look flattering for whatever their specialty is. And so I would say that the beginning of the downfall, even though, it perhaps predated your firing, the fact that you got canned and had your position taken away from you was appalling. And a lot of us said, this is a serious injustice, and that how can we trust an organization that would treat one of their star performers this way? And so some people would say, well, they don't like Peter's manner, or he's too brusque with people, or he's too direct. I know you're all of those things, but I like that, because you need people who are actually willing to say, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? And to be able to ask the hard questions. It struck me that the sort of the beginning of the end, well, I don't know if it's the end yet. I would say the beginning of the downfall of Cochrane was really catapulted when you were fired. And then shortly after, wasn't Mark Wilson left under mysterious circumstances, which we're not sure about. As you know, Peter, the organization still is still carrying on. However, they're going to be losing a major amount of its funding from the UK government. They're getting
it went, Alan. They lost, all the UK Cochrane groups lost their funding on the 31st of March this year. Okay. And most of the groups have actually closed. And a big chunk of the Cochrane groups in this world were in the UK. Yes. So this is a disaster. And the reason the major funder of Cochrane didn't want to fund Cochrane any longer was, for example, that at a webinar, the funder said that Cochrane should be careful that it did not become a garbage in, garbage out exercise, meaning that Cochrane reviewers were not critical enough when they went through the literature. And therefore, Cochrane reviews were actually not so reliable that people thought they were.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It takes, as you know, it takes courage to critically analyze and summarize and meta-analyze studies. It takes courage. It takes you have to make hard decisions, deciding on which studies are included and which studies aren't. I'll give you an example. If you include all of the studies of, say, mammography, topic you know very well, you might say, oh, there is some slight benefit in the population over time. But if you be careful and say, well, let's reject the low quality studies. Let's eliminate the studies which are not reliable or haven't reported proper input, and only use the quality studies. When you do that, you find that mammography makes no difference. So what does the average person on the street want? Do they want an organization to be a cheerleader for a procedure such as mammography screening? Or do they want them to say, let's look at the highest quality studies, let's analyze those, and let's give the truth to women based on those high quality studies? And I would say most people want that. If you want to do the other thing, including all studies, including the crap ones, and come out with a message that says there's some benefit, even though it's very small. You can do that, but are people going to want that? And I would argue that it's not just women facing mammography screening, but it's parents whose young kids are being told to take antidepressants, or it's people who are told to take 2 or 3 antihypertensive drugs to control their blood pressure. I mean, the influence of pharma, which does most of the clinical research, is so strong. If you don't have this filter to filter out the junk, the garbage, then you can actually do fairly clean, high quality meta-analyses. So it's not garbage in, it's garbage out. It's like we've gotten rid of the garbage. We're only including the good stuff in. And hopefully we're going to get good stuff out.
One other thing that is going to, I think, kill Cochrane, which I have discussed with many of my colleagues, and I would like to hear your views, is that Cochrane quite early on became very clubbish, that you were a member of some kind of an exclusive club and you did not criticize other members in public. So if they had done substandard research, you did not go out in public and published a comment in a medical journal pointing out that this Cochrane review is not okay for these and these reasons. If you did that, you faced serious problems. And I did that on several occasions, and I was told that now I had made this and that person sad because I had criticized her research. But this is really the heart of science, that we should be ready to criticize also our closest friends, also in public, because this scientific debate is what brings science and knowledge forward. And there, Cochrane has failed miserably. That's what many of us think. And what do you think, Alan?
Well, I think it's part of medicine. I mean, it's not just Cochrane that basically asks, you're either on our team or you're not on our team. Other organizations, medical organizations, doctors groups, medical specialties, if you are a criticizer, you're not welcome at the table, which goes against the whole spirit of Cochrane. In fact, when I interviewed Ian Chalmers, this was Ian Chalmers' labor of love for many years, getting Cochrane going and taking work that started in obstetrics and then applying it to all areas of medicine. And he named it after Archie Cochrane because Archie said we needed an organization that could do this high quality meta-analysis in all areas of medicine. When I interviewed Ian Chalmers, I asked him, how would you feel? And this was, again, this is almost a decade ago. How would you feel about the demise of Cochrane? And he said, I wouldn't shed a tear of Cochrane if another organization sprung up in its place and did the same thing. He said, what he most values of Cochrane is its spirit of self-criticism. And so let me argue that I am in total agreement with him. That was the spirit of Cochrane. It's the spirit of self-criticism, is that if Peter Gøtzsche does a shoddy review, even though he's a big, important doctor, I should be able to criticize his review based on my assessment of those studies. We can argue on the level of scientific debate, and that's a healthy thing, because after debate, usually we both become more knowledgeable. If you want to stifle debate, if you want to say critics aren't allowed, we're not going to listen to people who complain about our organization, then in many ways, your critics are your best friends, because they make you stronger and they make you better. So we should be inviting criticism, not canceling it. I mean, we saw this during the pandemic, where so many good scientists on the right side of things were canceled because they didn't agree with the dominant political narrative.
Oh yeah, the COVID pandemic has been absolutely awful in terms of introducing scientific censorship. And it's more and more clear now that the virus, of course, leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and it also seems highly likely that it was manufactured in Wuhan. And now the Sunday Times recently even launched the story that it might be part of a biological warfare program in China, because they work closely with the Chinese military.
Yeah.
And it has been completely impossible to say these things, because then you were censored. And
Yes. And when was the last time you saw a major publication do anything about trying to assess vaccine adverse effects?
No. I did a systematic review of the serious adverse effects of the COVID vaccines with my deputy director, Marianne Demasi from Adelaide in Australia. We have been totally unable to publish our systematic review anywhere. So
that doesn't surprise me. So there's scientific censorship in its finest form, right?
So we have uploaded it on our website now, the website of the Institute of Scientific Freedom, which we are both directing together. This horrible censorship, we must do everything we can to make it disappear again. And I think people realize more and more these days that we don't want to have societies like that, that are bringing us back to the Middle Ages, where the king decided what could be published or not. I mean, this is absolutely horrible for science. So when in October I had an international meeting about the lack of scientific freedom in Copenhagen, together with Carl Hennigan from the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, Tom Jefferson, one of the stars in Cochrane, you mentioned him.
Yes.
We interviewed Tom Jefferson after the meeting, and Tom was very unhappy with the censorship and the lack of scientific debate. And then he said, I have a suggestion to people to make a better world. It's really revolutionary. And then we sat back and thought, oh my goodness, what is Tom going to say now? Debate.
Yeah.
That's what we need, free debate.
And I think, like, so having studied the early history of Cochrane, the spirit of debate was very fresh. It was very exciting. And I think when you talk to people who were at those initial meetings, the first one in Oxford and then the second one in Hamilton, there was an excitement in the air, because even young people could challenge their superiors. Because when the specialist says, I think you should prescribe this drug, then the young person can say, can you point to the body of studies that suggests that that's an overall benefit? And if they can't, then what are they prescribing based on? They're based on expert opinion, which, as we know, is unreliable. And
and even worse, Alan, it was also often based on corruption, that doctors were paid by the drug industry.
There's that. Yes, of course. There's that. That's the most obvious thing. But the less obvious is that people have their financial and their professional careers embedded in a certain paradigm. For example, if you're a psychiatrist, what do you spend a lot of time doing? You prescribe antidepressants for almost everything. Are you going and you go to scientific meetings, mostly funded by the pharmaceutical industry? And do you become an expert on criticizing those drugs and criticizing and exposing the dangers of them? Well, you could do that, but then you would be censored and canceled as well. So I agree with Tom Jefferson about the value of debate. And again, looking at the history of Cochrane, that spirit of debate was very, very present. It kind of marked the organization as being very honest and willing to be self-critical. And I think that being self-critical is a mark of a high functioning organization and a person. And a person, you might have very strong ideas to something, but if you're not willing to accept valid criticism of your opinions based on science, then you're not doing your job. You're not a true scientist, in my opinion.
I can give you one recent example of the demise in Cochrane that relates to this. 5 years ago, I sent a complaint to the Cochrane schizophrenia group because they had published a review where the abstract was seriously misleading. They wrote that benzodiazepines don't work if you are acutely psychotic. And of course, if you are acutely psychotic, benzodiazepines do work because they are tranquilizers. They can calm you down and they can give you some sleep so that you can become better. And this was not what the studies had shown. So the abstract was totally misleading. And the abstract was actually benefiting psychiatry's guilt interest, because then what should you do if you didn't use benzodiazepines?
You give an antipsychotic.
Antipsychotics, which are
Yes.
very toxic and actually
Yes.
kill many people.
Yeah.
So I complained about that. And the Cochrane Schizophrenia Group was then obliged to publish my criticism with the review. They ignored me and didn't reply to my request for several years. Then after 4 years, I complained to Cochrane's editor-in-chief. And then she arranged that the group must publish my criticism. That took 5 years.
Wow.
But then I complained again, because why was there no response from the authors in the review to my criticism? And why was the Cochrane abstract not changed? So I complained again, and then they simply had to change the abstract. It was too embarrassing now for Cochrane. But it took me 5 years just to change the sentence in an abstract that was intensely misleading. To me, this is a sign of why Cochrane is going quickly downhill these years.
That sounds totally plausible. I mean, you stepped in a hornet's nest when you start criticizing one of the major, I would probably say the major financial boon to the pharmaceutical industry is the antipsychotic industry. They make more money off antipsychotics than they do on antidepressants, probably, than they do on ADHD drugs. It's a huge market. And how can they stand by and allow a group to criticize the value of their products?
Yeah, and you know, I have lectured for very many patients and relatives to patients. And I have asked many patient groups, next time you get an acute psychosis and get admitted to a psychiatric ward and need something to calm you down, if you could choose yourself, would you prefer a benzodiazepine, a sleeping pill, or an antipsychotic? So far, not a single patient has said, I prefer an antipsychotic. And yet, this is what all of them get. So, so there you have a specialty that actually doesn't deserve to survive.
It's a tough one though, Peter, because there are so many people who believe that they are suffering from psychiatric illnesses, whether they are or not, and that they go to psychiatrists hoping to have some relief for their mental distress, and for the most part, that begins the cycle and the cocktail of drugs that people get. As you know, the prescribing of antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, and drugs for ADHD in the last 3 years have gone off the charts. It was bad. It was bad pre-2020, bad in the sense of, why should 40% of the child population in the US be taking antidepressants? Why isn't anybody standing back and saying, this seems like really bad medicine? And I think you've hit on it. When you asked me the question, what do I think in terms of led to your main problems with Cochrane? And I don't know, but I know here's what I am hypothesizing, that you took on mammography, but mammography is small potatoes compared to the psychiatric industry.
Oh yeah.
Psychiatry is big, it's big money, and it's very strong vested interest and guild interest. And you challenge that paradigm in a way that would bring, it's kind of like, it's sort of like questioning the war in Ukraine. It brings the forces of war upon your head, because you are questioning something so fundamental. And I would argue that probably, though we may never know, that the pressure on Mark Wilson came from somewhere upstairs, even though he was the CEO and should have said, no, I'm here to defend good science. I'm here to defend our scientists who do Cochrane reviews, and piss off. We're not going to take, we're not going to succumb to your pressure. And that's what a strong person would do. A weak person would say, let's get this one guy as an outlier, make him as an example, right? An example that if you challenge the orthodoxy, if you challenge the leadership of Cochrane, you're going to end up like that guy in Denmark.
But that's the end of Cochrane. Then Cochrane doesn't deserve to survive if that is what it should be about, because then free debate is gone, and that is what I think we see today.
You know, I personally think that there are still some very, very good people in Cochrane, and some of them happen to be my friends at UBC and others, and I think they do, people like Jim Wright and others that do high quality reviews of antihypertensives, though I think they are thwarted by an increasingly kind of hostile leadership. Hostile debate is what I mean. And that rather than see Cochrane go disappear altogether, I would like to see it to reform itself, to realize that, okay, we've got some serious problems, we can correct them, we still have some good people, let's work on the right side of this, let's recognize what this problem is. And I would argue that largely it's the corporatization of medicine, and let's work to reform this, because who else is going to do it? And maybe starting your own institute might be one way to still try to foster these kind of debates that we need. But if anything, we need an organization that will openly and honestly debate important subjects in medicine, including the value of drugs and screening procedures and vaccines and so on. I mean, I would argue that in the last 3 years, Cochrane was missing in action when it came to the pandemic.
Oh, many people have noticed that.
And I was shocked that the people who should be the experts and advising governments on the value of things like antivirals or vaccines, people like Tom Jefferson, for example, and Carl Hennigan, were censored, pushed aside, and I think that's appalling. What Cochrane should have done is said, look, we've got these people. You know, Tom Jefferson has been immersed in influenza research for more than a decade, probably almost 2 decades, even more. Nobody knows this subject as well as he did. Let's take this guy and build a team around him, as opposed to
Alan. Alan, you have undoubtedly also seen one of the recent scandals in Cochrane, that when Tom Jefferson and his collaborators updated their Cochrane review on physical measures to prevent viral infections, and again concluded that there was no reliable evidence that face masks had any effect, then Cochrane's editor-in-chief apologized when somebody complained about their abstract. I mean, this is completely ludicrous.
And challenged by some journalist in the New York Times.
Oh yes,
Since when has a journalist in the New York Times an expert on the science again.
No,
not
no.
the opinion, the science
Well,
around
but-
physical interventions.
But the Cochrane's editor-in-chief went out and apologized. This was so appalling, and told a lot of people that some people in Cochrane do not deserve to sit in the positions they have. So when you mention that you have good friends that do good work, you mentioned Jim Wright. I know Jim very well and respect him a lot. We have some common friends, and you also hope that the best people in Cochrane will survive, and somehow Cochrane might survive based on these very best people. And I agree with you, that would be wonderful. But then there is a lot of cleaning up to do, because then Cochrane would need to get away with a lot of politically correct people who want to rub what do you say, rub shoulders with the drug industry and those who have the political power and so on. And this was never what Cochrane was meant to be.
No, Cochrane was meant to stand up against that.
Exactly.
The
But
fact
that's
that,
not. But that's not the Cochrane we see today.
right. Yes.
So maybe, Alan, maybe that would be a fine ending note for this conversation, that we both hope that somehow a new Cochrane will come out of the ashes that we currently see.
Yeah, and I would write another book about that if that were the case. I mean, let me just say that in the back of this book, well, there's a quote by Archie Cochrane that I put on the back of the book, and it says, "How can we have a rational health service if we don't know which of the things being done in it are useful and which are useless and possibly even harmful?" Well, you need people who can analyze the science and tell you this is what the science says about the benefits and the safety and the harms of your drug, your treatment, your screening procedure, etc. And if you don't have that, you can't have a rational health system. That because and then it's just going to be pre-Cochrane like. It's going to be run on expert opinion and whatever's politically correct at the time. And of course, Tom Jefferson stepped in a hornet's nest when he, had the audacity to question masks. Which, I mean, I was at my grocery store this morning, and people are still wearing masks. I mean, the pandemic's been. Oh yeah, I mean, this is how not people working there. I mean, this is how unscientific we have created the society that people are so fearful that they're doing something that's completely unscientific.
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe we should end here, Alan, and no one knows what will happen to Cochrane the next 5 years, but the organization is in great trouble right now, and we both hope that something better will come out of this.